Hello, I'm your host, Jean-Paul Baran, President of Focus on the Family Canada. Welcome to The Thriving Family, a Focus on the Family Canada podcast. As you tune in, you'll discover sound bites on marriage, parenting, and faith and culture from a Christian perspective. The Thriving Family podcast is made possible by generous donors who support our ministry. In this season of the podcast, we're talking about healing scars. These are difficult and challenging topics, but I am so thankful to serve God, the great physician who has the power to restore all. Today, we're in for an inspiring conversation with Carissa Youssef, a leader with a servant's heart who is passionate about God's redemptive work. Born in Chicago, Carissa lived throughout the Midwest until her family settled in Seattle in 1993. After graduating from high school, Carissa moved to British Columbia to attend university, where she earned her BA in Communications and later her MBA. Carissa spent nearly 15 years of dedicated work in the fight against extreme poverty, and she now serves as the executive director of One Day's Wages, where she continues to advocate for the most vulnerable. Carissa and her husband Bob live in Abbotsford, BC with their 2 daughters. I can't wait for you to hear the conversation between Carissa and my colleague Kara Pippy, our Chief Marketing Officer at Focus on the Family Canada. Let's dive in.
Welcome, Carissa Youssef. It's such a pleasure to have you with us here today on the Thriving Family podcast. How are you? Welcome.
I'm well, and I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you for inviting me.
You're more than welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And we were chatting a little bit before the recording here and letting you know that this is a very new podcast for us, and you are one of our first interviews. So thank you so much. It is exciting, right? And so much to look forward to in this podcast journey that we're on and getting to speak with leaders like yourself. And I just want to thank you again for making your way out here out of your busy schedule. I know there's a lot, very busy these days, so much going on. And but why don't we just dive into a little bit of your personal journey to get us started? Can you tell us, just inform our listeners, tell us a little bit about you, your family, maybe a little bit about your faith journey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start with kind of a current picture. I am married to my husband, whose name is Kara Youssef. He and his family immigrated to Canada when he was young. And we have 2 daughters, Alexandria, who's 15, and Abigail, who's 13. And a kind of a cool family tidbit, I guess you could say, is Bob grew up in Alexandria. He goes by Bob. I should have said that. Yeah. So Bob grew up in Alexandria, Egypt, and I grew up in Alexandria, Minnesota. Oh. And we met here in the Vancouver area in university. So when we found out our first child was a daughter, we had to name her Alexandria. Yeah. So that's a fun little bit there.
That is fun. Mm-hmm. That is a fun connection there. Yeah,
absolutely. So I was born in the States. I was born in Chicago, and I grew up with the incredible privilege of having parents who loved Jesus and really modeled what it looked like to follow him. But something that was a little bit unique was that I also was able to experience what it looks like to have a parent model what it looks like to end well. When I was 14 years old, my dad was diagnosed with a really rare form of leukemia. And we had just moved out to the Seattle area, which is how I actually ended up coming to the Vancouver area, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Yeah. And he had been laid off from his job. And so when we had this cancer diagnosis, we didn't have any health insurance. And in the States, as you know, that's a pretty big deal. It's pretty isolating. It can be something that can really impact you in the sense of your finances. And I was able to experience firsthand the beauty of what it looks like to have God's community come alongside you in a really vulnerable time. Our family we had people walk alongside of us through a 2-year cancer journey in really profound ways. That was a really challenging time for us. It was very vulnerable to not have income and to have watch a parent, go through a cancer diagnosis. And so there was a couple of things about that experience in my life that really kind of changed the trajectory of my professional life, if you will. I know lots of us have these kind of defining moments.
Right.
Yes. And during that period of time, I experienced 2. One was really this idea of watching how God's people came alongside of us and offered help. So there was really healthy ways that we experienced that help, and then there was some really hard ways. And that really propelled me into a journey of what it looks like to walk alongside vulnerable communities, both here in Canada and around the world. Another defining moment from that journey was when my dad realized that God was going to take him home. He invited me, each of us siblings, into his hospital room individually, and he sort of commissioned me. Like, he knew he wouldn't be there for a lot of those special moments. I was 16. And so he looked at me and he said, Carissa, here's 3 things that I'm going to pray for you, that I'm going to call you into. He said, follow Jesus's heart, express your heart, and build your life on people.
That's such a beautiful prayer.
To have a parent commission you into that was a total gift. Wow. And it really helped kind of set that trajectory for me.
That's incredible. That's such an emotional story. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And I can only imagine, in those moments, and that as a 16-year-old girl, essentially having those words spoken over you and then just kind of carrying that with you into your journey in career, professional, and personal life. That must have made a profound impact.
It did. Yeah. It became kind of a bit of a framework for me as I had to make a lot of really important decisions over my life to be able to say, how does this decision or this direction kind of go back and honor those, that calling, if you want to call it that.
So now this was back in Seattle?
That was in the Seattle area. Okay. Yeah. Yep. So my family's all in the States, but I moved, I came up to go to university after high school, and that's where my husband and I met. And so I was, lucky enough to be one of those dual citizens. So have lived in Canada for a very long time now, and have 2 passports. So.
That's fantastic. And have you been to Egypt? I'm just curious.
Yes. That's a fun question. Yeah. Yes, Bob and I were able to go before we had kids and spent almost 3 weeks in just visiting family, taking in some of the sights. And honestly, just my favorite parts were just going out with family to cafes and restaurants and just absorbing as much of the culture that I could. It's an absolutely beautiful country.
Oh, wow. I hope to go there one day.
I hope you do too.
Fantastic. So now you have worked in both for-profit and nonprofit sectors. What drew you to nonprofit leadership? And to One Day's Wages specifically?
Yeah, great question. I think I knew from pretty early on that my heart was really soft towards the helping services and the helping sector. So I think going into the nonprofit space wasn't a big surprise to anybody who knows me. I had another, I would say, kind of defining moment. Well, it wasn't a moment, but my time with an organization that was focused on international development really actually propelled forward my spiritual walk as well. I loved the work that we were doing, but it ultimately, I was sort of confronted with a new definition of poverty. And it was really meaningful for me because I think experiencing vulnerability as a Canadian or as a North American, I think we sort of create different definitions of poverty, or maybe we don't experience, we may not see ourselves as being same because we're comparing to somebody who has it worse. But I think there's a vulnerability that as just sort of humanity we can all experience. But I was confronted with a definition of poverty in that work environment that said poverty is broken relationships with God, self, others, and creation. And I found that so profound. And it reminded me so much of 2 Corinthians 5, where we're given, Jesus gives us this ministry of reconciliation to participate in. And if you reverse that definition of poverty, the solution to poverty is then reconciled relationship with God, self, others, and creation. So it just became this really rich sort of spiritual development for me in my walk professionally and personally. And in that, as I strive in all that I do to work towards that reconciliation of all things. I had the privilege of kind of touring across Canada and getting a front row seat, in particular, to how Christian business leaders were responding to God's call about caring for their neighbors. So their local community and their global community. And a lot of the conversations that we had really vulnerably as we sat together was saying, these business leaders are saying, we want to be more than a check, right? We truly want to embody Jesus's call to care for our neighbor. And so we're struggling with how to do that. And so that was an incredible opportunity for me to get to know them and to see that. And it's actually what propelled me to then go into the business sector for a few years, because I was so excited about what I saw God doing through Canadian Christian business leaders who really wanted to take God's commandments seriously about loving their neighbor. So I was able to join with some friends who had a construction company. And we worked together for a couple of years because they wanted to take that call seriously. What does it look like to have a purpose-driven business, but then invite God into every aspect of the business so that it could be used as a redemptive force in the world?
That's incredible. So this business was a construction business?
Yes, in Abbotsford.
How exactly did they incorporate those sort of biblical or faith principles into their work, construction work?
Absolutely. On the purpose side, it was simply that they expanded the traditional business stakeholders to include two more. So the traditional business stakeholders would be your owners or your shareholders, depending on what kind of business you have, your employees, your vendors, your clients or customers, and then, of course, government, because you need to be able to pay taxes and follow regulation. Two more, your local community and your global community. So what does it look like to create and structure your company to be inclusive of those stakeholders as well? And it just changes your perspective a little bit. How are we impacting our local neighbors? And what is our company? What can we give back? How do we include them? Some of that can be through really helpful job creation. Some of it is philanthropic. And then to be really mindful of that. But on the operations side, to be a redemptive business means you have to care all the way into your kind of each of your line items. What does it look like to have a redemptive business in your HR practices? What does it look like to have that in sort of your supply management? That might sound kind of boring to a lot of people, but it's really exciting when you press in, because to be redemptive means you have to sacrifice. You can do things ethically without being redemptive. But to say, Jesus, what does it look like for us to really model your care and love of others through our practices? So we leaned into that hard, and it was a lot of work and it was uncomfortable. But I think the reward was worth it.
That's incredible. I think whenever you invite God into business or any endeavor, he's going to honor that and bless that. And so that's great. I wish more business professionals thought that way. I think it could be a much different world, certainly. Okay, so just backing up a little bit, I want to hear more about your faith journey.
Yeah, my dad was a pastor in the Evangelical Free Church when I was young, and then he transitioned into running a business. And so I think that's one of the things that make it even ties in, I think, to some of my vocational path, because he set this really beautiful example of what it looks like to be all in for Jesus, regardless of if your vocation is considered ministry or not. He just saw it all as ministry because he was loving people. And so that was a really beautiful example. My mom was a nurse and then a homemaker, and then she ended her career as a hospice nurse, which was a really beautiful thing for me to witness as well, because it takes a really special person to walk alongside people at that end of life, and she had lived it, supporting my dad in his cancer journey, and so then she was able to give that gift to dozens, if not hundreds of families at the end of her career. So my parents modeled what it looked like to follow Jesus. And it was really during that period of vulnerability where my dad was sick and we utterly depended on other people, to the point where, we were able to pay cash for cancer treatments because people were sending us checks. Like, our food was supplied to us from our church community. Like, we had nothing. And it was just the kindness of God's people that journeyed with us. So that was a profoundly marking time of my life where I experienced Jesus's kindness and grace.
Right.
But it wasn't until university where I was able to sort of receive his love. I witnessed it, but there was a lot of, there's a lot of hard in high school anyways, but when you're also the oldest of 4 kids and you're trying, to be supportive of your parents because they're going through this huge crisis, a lot of my time was spent in serving in, the church and these sorts of things, and I loved it. It marked me. I think I learned discipleship at a young age. But God got my whole heart in university. And I remember I was with this ministry group, And we were on a service trip in Brazil, and I'd gotten up really early to have some quiet time, and I was sitting on a sand dune, and I just remember God impressing into my heart John 10:10, that he had come to give us life in the fullness. And there had been some self-protection that had really built up through the loss that I'd experienced and the vulnerability that I experienced of losing a parent at a young age. And I just almost audibly felt Jesus inviting me to take those walls down and let him have my whole heart. Wow. So I've been trying to live that way ever since.
I love that. That's such a great story. And just reflecting on, I've had those moments in my journey as well, where you feel the Lord is just really impressing upon you a message or just a promise or something to believe in. And it's really great to hear that he's made such an impact on your life and that you've really taken that to heart. And
absolutely.
With One Day's Wages, according to a little bit of research I've done online, so One Day's Wages is a nonprofit organization that exists to alleviate extreme poverty by investing in, amplifying, and coming alongside locally led organizations in underserved communities.
Yes, so it's a mouthful.
But I think that's great. It kind of sums it up. But can you expand on that for us? Tell us a little bit more about the mission and the important work that you and your team are doing there.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. It's probably not a surprise that I came back into the nonprofit sector. I think I'll be involved in both for the rest of my life, I hope, redemptive business and the nonprofit work. I am really passionate about walking alongside the world's most vulnerable. And so that's where, when I got the call from One Day's Wages, it was a very, the mission resounded with me. I had felt compelled over several years leading up to that invitation to really focus in on directly supporting locally led organizations around the world. There are so many communities and so many leaders around the world who have lived experience and have the local expertise to solve a lot of the problems in their community. They don't need to be rescued. They need to be resourced. And I feel like God has given us the skill set to really mobilize resources to do exactly that. And so it's a real privilege for us to be able to identify partners around the world who are doing that good, beautiful, hard work in their communities. And then our invitation is actually really simple, and it's reflected in our name, where we desire for everyone to donate just one day's wage as often as they can towards this really big problem of alleviating poverty. And then everyday ordinary people pooling those resources together, directing it towards these local leaders, are able to make a profound difference in some of these really big problems.
I love it. That is incredible. And what kind of programs are you able to, what kind of programs have you developed, and what kind of impact are you able to make in a practical sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we focus predominantly on really big, I'll call them issues, like clean water or education, access to health, etc. Lots of really common ones. But one thing that's a little different about our approach is we don't actually create program or strategy. We're looking for the kind of organization who is already working towards those initiatives and simply needs the resources to follow through on it. So we actually hold really open-handed philanthropy in our partnership, where our partners are actually helping us by telling us how they measure impact. Okay. So I'm really passionate about flipping the power structure when it comes to philanthropy, where those with lived experience get to really help set those markers. So it's a partnership through and through. We really want to come alongside in the truest sense of that phrase. And so it takes a lot of relationship, and it takes a lot of time before we even get started, learning a little bit more about what work they've done in their community to determine how to move forward. One of the partnerships that we have right now that I find incredibly meaningful is actually working with a partner in Cameroon who the leader of this not-for-profit that we're resourcing, she's a widow. and so faced a lot of vulnerability in her life and had received some money to start a small business. And instead of just feeling like she made it and she was going to be okay, she turned around and created a nonprofit to help other widows in her area of the world. And so she's bringing her lived experience and her expertise and built up a team around her and is now making exponential impact by really focusing in on those with that shared experience. So to me, that's one of the most beautiful examples of finding somebody who is really qualified to lead that work.
Right.
So we've made over 300 grants over the last 16 years. We call them grants because even though we don't want to be seen as transactional, we want to be seen as relational, we really want to stay in our lane, which is mobilizing resources.
That's incredible. You really see that multiplication factor there.
Absolutely.
So, I've worked in international development as well in a past role and was really passionate about that work. And as you mentioned, sometimes the folks that we meet in these very vulnerable areas of the world, they just need the resources. They just need the information and some tools to be able to do great things within their own community. And then, like you say, those people who have those leadership abilities and they want to help, you can see something as simple as, someone receiving a small loan and then building their own little business and then starting, to employ others in their communities. And it's great. Yeah. It's fantastic. Yeah. And again, just needing those resources and a little bit of education to get them off the mark. And,
absolutely. Well, and I think we can see that in our in ourselves and in our own communities too, right? I think sometimes we separate out local and international work, but it really starts by saying, what do you already have, right, in that context? Yeah. And then how can I come alongside and support you? Right. And I think that's one of the things I get really motivated by is helping Canadians help really well, because often I find, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but everything from sort of even just like how our schools want to help and all, our faith communities want to help and with different kinds of food drives and this sort of thing. Sometimes I think one of the mistakes that we make unintentionally is that we don't actually ask a lot of questions or do really good listening at the beginning to understand what's the real way for us to come alongside that would make the most difference. Often our imagination is sparked right away with what we think we can do. Right. And so our intentions are really good. Yeah. But then, we can accidentally cause harm in the process. So that asking those good questions and listening at the beginning are pretty important.
Yeah, I agree 100%. So as a Christian leader, how do you personally define social responsibility and how has that definition evolved through your work at One Day's Wages?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know for social responsibility, I think right away the business brain is activated for me because I think it's a term we've gotten really familiar with. And it kind of started off as a bit of a PR initiative, right? Where we're like, let's add on this, like, how do we give back to the community? And over the years, I've been really inspired, for good or for bad. We've tried in the Canadian context to, I think, embody that a little bit more and to say, hey, we really do want to think about how our businesses operate. For me as a believer, which I think is always going to, be sort of that strongest formation for me on my ideas and beliefs, is that it means loving my neighbor. And Christ's love compels me to care about and observe and be aware of those around me. So when I think about social responsibility as a Christian leader, I think about the privilege that I have to be able to use the assets God has given me, whether it's expertise, whether it's financial resources, whether it's time, to be able to lift up those who are in the margins or those who might otherwise be forgotten. And I think it just comes down to trying to follow Jesus's example.
Great. That's great. At Focus on the Family, we often talk about thriving families.
Yes, I love that word.
Yeah, and and a lot of what we focus on here, pardon the pun, but a lot of what we focus on here is around marriage and parenting, life challenges in its various forms, and then faith and culture. But how would you define human flourishing in the context of justice and global development? Are families abroad in these very vulnerable situations dealing with those same types of things, or are they thinking more along the lines of survival or something else? What are some of the challenges that these families are facing?
That's a really great question. What comes to mind for me right away was one of the trips I took. I was visiting Uganda. And I was so impressed by, probably like you and others who have had the privilege of being able to travel to other parts of the world. I was so impressed with the beauty and the hope, that really impoverished communities or underserved communities were expressing. It surprised me the first couple of times I traveled, because I had a picture of poverty that was against the word picture that we have with thriving. And so I was really surprised and a little bit, again, convicted that about how we measure thriving. I remember traveling through this one community, and one of the leaders that was taking me had said, watch for flowers, because people without hope don't plant things. But if they're hopeful, you're going to see it. You're going to see that in their yards. You're going to see flowers. And so it was one of the things that always kind of stood out to me was going, watch for the flowers. So we may expect thriving to look a certain way in Canada. And I think we have to be really careful of that, because even here in our home context, it's sometimes on the surface you can't tell, right? If somebody might be really well off or comfortable, there may not be a lot of conflict that you can see in their family. But what's deeper than that? What's below that, right? And again, to me, that definition of thriving or flourishing always comes back to that definition of reconciled relationships. How would they rate their relationship with God? Is it flourishing? And what does that look like? How about their relationship with themselves, right? Are we dealing with our trauma and our pain? Are we aware of what we're bringing into our parenting? I parent out of my wounds all the time. And I need to hold awareness to that. And I need my husband to help me with that. And I need my community to help me with that. So, how are we working on that reconciled relationship? And then with others in creation, the same thing applies. So that's how I look at thriving. And I think it takes relationship, because it's not usually what you see at first glance.
Right. One thing that comes to mind, because I also went to Uganda.
Okay, wonderful.
And, it's such a beautiful country, and the people are so lovely and so warm. And one thing that really stood out to me was, they live with very little, right? And they are just, according to Western standards, right? They are surviving with few things, but they are so content. It seems, anyways. It seems like they have this joy and this genuine warmth and love that, even though times are tough, they have faith. They care for one another. They're very family oriented, and they will invite you in. And you may be sitting on a bucket or something, but they'll invite you in, and they want to share with you. They want to share a meal with you. They want to share stories with you. They are genuinely interested. I remember one family we visited, and they wrote a song for us. Like, it was just beautiful. so beautiful and so genuine. And when we were flying back to Canada, then I was just reflecting on that, and I thought, wow, those people, like those families that I met there are just, because they were Christians, and they had such joy in their hearts, even though they had very difficult circumstances. And it made me think about how different it is here in Canada and North America, whereas, we have all the conveniences, we have all the stuff, right? All the material things. But oftentimes we lack that joy in our hearts and that genuine faith and really loving our neighbors well, for whatever reasons. It just seems that we aren't as content at times. So it's a very interesting dichotomy. And so interesting that we got to share some of those same experiences.
Absolutely.
In Uganda. And,
that's special.
At One Day's Wages, you work with families in extremely vulnerable situations. And some of the most pressing, what are some of the most pressing challenges that families face there today? Maybe just playing off what we just spoke about.
Sure. Absolutely. We work in multiple countries around the world, as I said, and supporting the local leaders. And so these aren't our programs, but what I see time and time again are the complexities that I know our listeners are very familiar with. We just have a lot of complex situations in the world right now. And so as we really want to focus in on alleviating extreme poverty, that often leads us to supporting programs in really complex contexts. So things like refugee settlements, things like informal settlements, which a lot of people would refer to as slums. And those are really Those are really challenging contexts. So in addition to not having secure food sources, you're in a refugee camp you don't own land. You've got a very small group of, space to work with. And so to be able to come in and support farming co-ops in that context, I think is really meaningful work. So we're looking for all of the added layers in any context that produce extreme vulnerability. So if they're, widows, if they're refugees, if they have a struggle with social inclusion, perhaps they have some form of a handicap. Those kinds of vulnerabilities just make things perpetually harder. So when we can find people who are responding with programs in those contexts with multiple layers of vulnerability being addressed, that is like the perfect fit for us.
Right.
We're really looking at how we can make the biggest difference there.
Okay, great. Is there a particular story, perhaps there's a family that you've met on your journey with One Day Wages? Is there a particular family or a story that really resonates with you that really benefited from a Canadian family that supported them in some way? Maybe there's an impact story or a testimonial that you could share with us.
Yeah. Okay, if it's okay, I'm going to kind of flip that a little bit because some of the stories that pop into my mind right away are actually on the Canadian family side of things. Okay. So I've had the privilege to get to know so many families who have really taken God's call of loving your global neighbors seriously. And some of the things that I think inspired me the most is, so we were just chatting a few minutes ago about sort of that trying to find joy and contentment and gratitude when in our Western context we have so much. And what I've seen over and over again in families that really inspires me is a posture of understanding that everything they have is God's and they are simply stewarding it. So I've been really inspired by lots of different ways that people have chosen to respond, where there was this one couple that I was working with. They wanted to make a meaningful gift, and they came up with the coolest structure for their family. They kept a list all year of their needs versus their wants. Down to the very detail of they were buying a car. So they put the base price in their little spreadsheet under what they need, and anything they added on, they put under wants. Okay. And they did this all year, and at the end of the year, they cut a check equal to what their wants added up to. Wow. So they were really intentional and trying to be really thoughtful. And they said it changed how they spent all year because they were thinking about this. One of the things I love about working now with One Day's Wages and getting to meet all these different donors who are participating is this idea of saying, hey, I'm going to deliberately give my 1 day's wage and then be thinking about that number really specifically, because recognizing that when you pool together with a lot of other people, you can get a whole lot further than when you're doing it all by yourself. And so I think that's beautiful, and that's one of the things that drew me to One Day's Wages was this idea that we're pooling our resources towards causes and issues that we're really passionate about, and then we're trusting our local leaders, through the grants to do the work. So the connection between donors with 1 day's wages and the families overseas are not direct. They never will be. We're not looking to build those relationships. We're building trust with the local leaders, and so we're just open-handedly coming alongside of them, which is really beautiful in its own way.
Fantastic. So when we think about loving our neighbor today, what does solidarity look like in practice for the average Canadian family? And how can we teach our children to care about people whom they may never meet?
Yeah, that's a great question. Solidarity versus charity is really important to me, so I love that you used that phrase. I think, again, it comes down to, as believers especially, really being grounded in what God has invited us into, because it can be really dangerous to find yourself in a space where it's us and them, or there's an otherness that often happens when we're helping. My children will never understand what it's like to live a different path because it's not theirs, but what they can do is that they can build relationships and friendships and hopefully be modeled what it looks like to get to know people who are different than you. And for that to be less obvious, right? It's just normal to have that. I think being able to really assess where God has placed you. Like, what's the proximity in your life towards other people, and where's God working, and how can you kind of come alongside? So I would really encourage us as North Americans to actually know our neighbors. Right? Let's start there.
Right.
It's really hard to do. Whether you're in a condo or if you're, in a, suburban environment or an urban environment, we have an actual opportunity to look up from our phones and talk to people, right? Yes. So if I don't know how many people stand in line at grocery stores anymore. I know I tend to order groceries online. We've eliminated through convenience a lot of ways to actually interact with people. Right. So I think that's the first challenge. Take that as an opportunity. How many people can we say hi to today? Mm-hmm. Can we remember their names? Because I think sometimes it's actually easier to help internationally because, you can kind of write a check, or you can, who writes checks anymore, Carissa? You know what I mean? You can donate online and you can feel good about that. And that's wonderful. But I think that there's something about our hands, and being really practical expressions of Christ's love in our own communities that's equally important. I'm all about and. Yes, right. And. Yeah. Local and global. And so I would say proximity is really important, who's in front of you. And then I would really invite listeners to be thoughtful as a family to talk through different maybe issues that maybe the Holy Spirit has made you really soft towards. Right. Maybe you're really soft towards housing issues in your community. Maybe it's those who are hungry. Right. Maybe it's people who don't have strong, social or family units to depend on. Look for ways to get involved based on maybe how the Holy Spirit is prompting you. I know my husband and I went through an exercise years ago where we just said, you can give in all kinds of directions. The need is immense. We know that, right? Our listeners know that. If anything, I think we're at a point now where it's just it's tempting to just opt out because it's so overwhelming. Right. But if you can take that opportunity as a family to say, how do we want to give back? What does it look like for us to live out loving our neighbors and be thoughtful and intentional about it? And then that way we get to be proactive rather than reactive. Perhaps God has put it on your heart that you want to really give globally. That's great. Right. Find some trusted partners and then be faithful. Right. Give long, deep, hard in the same direction for a long time. Yeah. It's less about how we feel when we respond to a need. I think we accidentally do that. I do it. I still do it today, right? Where I'm like, I gave and that makes me feel really good. Yeah. But to instead see it as a form of discipleship and an act of worship to say we're committing in these directions. And so I think that just helps us make really good choices.
Amen. I agree. I think that if we invite the Lord into those decisions and if you have it in your heart to want to give, right? And just pray, Lord, how would you want me to steward these resources that you've blessed me with? How can I be a blessing to other people? Yes. And just listen, and like you said, maybe it's a local organization, maybe it's global. Yeah. I love what you were saying about reaching out to our neighbors. Loneliness is such an epidemic right now.
Absolutely.
And just knowing people in our own neighborhoods. I have some examples of friends that I know, and they live in lovely neighborhoods, but unfortunately they don't know their neighbors, right? And so I think we can start there.
We've all been there.
Yeah, we can start there and expand on that. But it's certainly inviting the Lord into those decisions, and I think that's a great approach. Yeah. And if you could invite our listeners to take a simple step towards compassion and just an invitation to reach out to our global community, what would you say to our listeners today?
Where I would start actually is just in this moment we find ourselves in, and I know those listening can relate, and I'm sure you do as well. There's a overwhelming crisis of need. And I know that for myself, and I've dedicated my career to this space, but it can be daunting, right? Instead of, getting up early and maybe praying for just, in certain directions, it's just easier to kind of zone out and maybe just, turn on Netflix or something. My first encouragement to stay compassionate is twofold. First is don't be complacent. Stay engaged. Keep your heart soft, because it can be really easy to go into that self-protection mode, or to say, I can't know all of these things. I know that there's a lot of truth to the fact that we are not wired to hold the whole world's problems, right? And that song that from my childhood keeps coming back, that he's got the whole world in his hands. Like, God's got it.
Right.
We are simply invited to participate. So there's that posture too, right? Again, of going back to like, what is God inviting us into? So I would say, just don't tune out. Stay soft and choose something. Do something. And I think that's why I love the name One Day's Wages so much. It's like, just do that. One day's wage. Just do something simple. Do be faithful. But don't also be labored down with guilt or, overwhelm, but to choose joy. I think with how hard things are and how dark things are, it's actually an opportunity for our resistance to show up so much brighter when we choose love, when we choose hope. I've been referring to myself lately as just stubbornly optimistic, and it's because there's a bigger story. And that goes back, this is the second thing I would encourage people to do, is remember the bigger story that we're a part of as followers of Jesus, and look for ways that he has been faithful. Remind ourselves. I spend a lot of time remembering, because it actually then sort of adjusts my it's a spiritual practice that adjusts my perspective. God's kindness to me and my family in our times of need, God's kindness and gracious and generosity to my community. And if we're constantly focusing on those things, it gives us a much more resilience when we look forward and out into the really hard world to say, yes, but we have a good, great God who loves us and who has the whole world in his hands. We're simply participating.
I love it. That's such an encouragement. Thank you. So how can people learn more? How can our listeners learn more about One Day's Wages, and how can they get involved in a meaningful way?
Well, they can learn more at onedayswages.org. And I would encourage the first step to simply be that first gift of one day's wage, and keep it really simple. We have a monthly newsletter where we focus on beautiful stories from around the world, good news, impact from our partners, because it's one way that we can show up differently in a really broken world right now. So that's another opportunity. Equally, I would just say sit down as a family and really talk about, what does philanthropy in your family look like? Philanthropy is just the love of humanity. And as Jesus followers, that should fill up and outflow, out into every area of our lives. So what does it look like to love your neighbor, both locally and globally?
Awesome. I love it. Thank you so much, Carissa. It's been such a joy and a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us here on the Thriving Family podcast. I wish you every blessing and continued success in your role and just helping families around the world overcome extreme poverty. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
I want to thank Carissa for joining us for such a refreshing and encouraging conversation, and for reminding us to love our neighbors each and every day. Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Thriving Family, a podcast from Focus on the Family Canada. If you like this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to subscribe. If you feel led, you can make a donation at focusonthefamily.com/podcast giving. This program is available ad-free because of the generosity of our donors. If you wish to talk about this further, or if it brought up something that you would like to talk through, you can have a free one-time consultation with one of our registered counselors at Focus on the Family Canada over the phone. Give us a call at 1-800-661-9800 to request a consult. It's our gift to you. Most importantly, please remember that we are here for you and your family.